Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, and welcome to our Global Insights panel today. In today's panel, we're hosting experts from the Balsillie School of International Affairs in Canada, the American University in Washington, D.C., and the Institute of Strategic Affairs in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. All panelists are speaking on the topic of human insecurity in a water-scarce world. My name is Fitz-Gerald. I'm the director of the Balsillie School, and I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar. A warm welcome to all participants joining us today in the audience. We would invite you to direct any questions you may have using the Q&A function of your Zoom panel, and we'll channel them to our best ability to the appropriate panelists, particularly towards the end of the session. Before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. For those of you in the audience joining us today from outside of Canada, one of the actions we take here in Canada to advance reconciliation between the settler and the Indigenous peoples is to reflect on our relationship with the land and the continuous process of colonization that deeply impacts our work. Acknowledging the land is the process of deliberately naming that this is Indigenous land and that Indigenous peoples have rights to this land. The Balsillie School of International Affairs, hosting the webinar today, is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, which is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. It's particularly important that we here at the school acknowledge the land on which we are situated in all that we do, including our Global Insights sessions. Now let's turn to today's distinguished panel members. Ken Conca is a professor in the School of International Service at the American University. His research and teaching focuses on global environmental governance, environmental peacebuilding in war-torn societies, environmental politics and policy in the United Nations system, water governance, and environmental policy analysis. His most recent books are the Oxford Handbook of Water Politics and Policy and An Unfinished Foundation, the United Nations and Global Environmental Governance. He is the editor of the widely used teaching anthology, Green Planet Blues. Dr. Conca's research has been recognized with several prestigious awards, including the Grawemeyer Prize for Ideas Improving World Order, the International Studies Association's Harold and Margaret Sprout Award for Best Book on International Environmental Affairs, the Chadwick Alger Prize for Best Book in the Field of International Organization, and the Al Muma Environmental Peacebuilding Award. He is a member of the UN Environmental Programme's Expert Advisory Group on Conflict and Peacebuilding. Dr. Abule Mehare is Senior Researcher at the Institute of Strategic Affairs in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. He is also an assistant professor at Haramaya University. Dr. Abule is widely published and is also a postdoctoral researcher at the Ethiopia Economic Association. His research focuses on agricultural and resource economics. Debora van Nijnatten is professor in the Department of Political Science and North American Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University here in Waterloo, and a faculty member at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Her research and publications have focused on transboundary environmental governance in North America at the cross-border regional bilateral Canada-US and US-Mexico and continental levels. Recent funded research has focused on the design and application of governance indicators for adaptive management in transboundary water basins in the US-Mexico Rio Grande and US-Canada Great Lakes. She also has a continuing interest in Canadian climate policy, Canada-US and US-Mexico environmental relations, as well as multi-level governance strategies for sustainability in North America. She's published 5 books and more than 50 articles and book chapters on environmental policy and governance. Thanks again to all panelists for sharing your insights with us today. So as the planet warms, more and more places around the world are experiencing periods of drought and water scarcity. One need look no farther than the west coast of North America, which is currently experiencing its worst drought in recent history. So Abule, I would like to start with you and ask you, what generally do you see as the link between water scarcity and climate change?
Yeah, well, water scarcity and climate change are directly related, and there is also this vicious circle of relationship between water scarcity and climate change, especially in these countries where we are applying more water and using extensive use of water without even having enough water to irrigate our farmland, especially for agrarian economics like most of African countries where we are mainly dependent on rain-fed agriculture, but we are not really saving the water what we are getting during the rainy seasons. Then this scarcity of water comes in when we are linking with its climate change, because the emission from the agricultural sector is directly affecting, inducing this climate change, which means unpredictable weather variabilities, the intensity of rain, the intensity, temperature fluctuations in the country or in the globe. And then it is also affecting the production and the productivity of the sector. Then vice versa, it is also affecting the other sectors of the economy, and globally, it is really impeding a serious impediment for the development of most of these countries.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so when we talk about water scarcity and climate change, we are talking about extreme weather events that are directly linked to climate change, because this climate change is inducing extreme weather events, and then it is affecting the water availability, that is a clean water for production and productivity, and also for human consumption. Then this water scarcity directly induces, again, that is what I was talking about, the vicious circle of climate change. So when there is a scarcity, people also will abuse the scarce resource itself, then it will also bring in another, pressure into the factors that are inducing climate change. Yeah.
Thank you. So Ken, just building on that, what in your view are the most important challenges facing the water sector around this climate adaptation?
Thanks, Anne. It's great to be here. There are many. I'll highlight just a couple to get us started. First, I would pick up on the point that Abule made about uncertainty. Maybe the biggest challenge of adaptation that we have is we have to learn how to plan for water under much more uncertain conditions. Water planning today tends to take its best guess about what future conditions are going to be, and then plan accordingly, whether that's building infrastructure, whether it's permitting different forms of water use, whether it's negotiating allocations among users. The problem is we've entered a period where there's just so much uncertainty, and it's not just climatological uncertainty, it's also financial uncertainty, it's also political uncertainty. What will the future price of water be? What will the future price of land be? Food, interest rates. We have to look under those uncertain conditions for much more robust responses, whether it's technologies, whether it's the investments we make, whether it's the policy frameworks. We need policies that are going to work across a range of potentially very different futures. Something that looks optimal today, whether it's a large dam or an irrigation scheme or a set of dikes and levees for flood control, it might look like the right choice today, but it might not be the most adaptive and flexible response. So we need a change in the mentality of planning that values flexibility and the capacity to adjust as conditions change. Second thing we have to do is we have to keep the focus on equity. We all know that climate change is profoundly unfair. The people that are driving it are not the people that will suffer the most and suffer first. But the adaptations can be unfair as well. We need to price water better. We need to reallocate water. We have to recycle and reuse water. Those are all essential adaptations. But they're going to create losers as well as winners, and they're going to deny some people access to water at the same time that they make more water available for other people and other users. And if we're not careful, the folks that are forced to adjust will be among the most vulnerable communities, and therefore there's a sort of a double indignity there, the unfairness of climate change and the potential unfairness of some of the water adaptations. So we've got to keep the focus on equity front and center.
Thank you very much. So Deborah, just building on this, like this has profound implications for governance. So To what degree and in what ways can we expect existing international agreements and programming to help guide states' water management activities, especially when water is shared among countries?
Yeah, well, thanks, Anne, and thank you very much for inviting me to be on the panel today. So all water management in shared basins is multi-scalar, right? So you've got functions that are divided across scales, from the international to the transboundary to the national to, subnational, so state, provinces, federated units, and then local governments, right? So that's kind of a reality of how we manage water. But what exists at the top in terms of the governance architecture really sends signals, down, and then we've got sort of signals being sent up from the bottom in terms of water rights, regimes, etc. Now, if we understand international to mean transboundary, then I would say in North America, then the treaties that we have on the US-Mexico and the Canada-US borders, and the executive agreements in various places as well, they're hugely significant, right? So they are focused on how we share water on this continent. However, and here I'll link to what my colleagues have said, those agreements were set up in order to allocate water, not to conserve water and not to plan for, future scary climate scenarios. So we're locked into these rigid architectures that are not particularly helpful. If we understand international to be sort of the global regime, well, things are pretty patchy, right? Because we don't have a firm legal structure, for example, that governs groundwater. There are some substantive and procedural obligations that are set out in international law, or there are some principles that are literally being worked on as we speak, right? But these are really quite nascent. So we don't have a firm international architecture to kind of guide these systems in this era, Ken said, of increasing, scarcity, but also uncertainty.
So that to me sounds very frightening. Let's stick to this strategic level of international and regional governance. And Ken, can I come back to you and ask, how effective have the Sustainable Development Goals been in enhancing human security around water?
Well, certainly they've been better than their predecessors, the Millennium Development Goals, which covered the period from the 2000 to 2015 before the SDGs kicked in. The Millennium Development Goals had a very narrow focus on increasing access to drinking water and sanitation, which is of course important, but not, the SDGs are much more comprehensive. They also focus on protecting the freshwater ecosystems that our water supplies ultimately depend upon. And they emphasize the complete eradication of water poverty, which focuses not simply on households, but also on schools, on health care facilities, all the places where people use water. So that's an improvement in policy terms for sure. That said, the deficit is still large. It's estimated that almost 700 million people around the world rely on what we would normally call an unimproved source of water, which means unprotected surface water of uncertain quality, or informal vendors in cities selling water, also often of uncertain quality. And that's a very minimal standard to have an improved source of water. If we use the standard we'd really like to use, safely managed drinking water, which means water that arrives on the premises, that is free of contamination, and it is supplied at the time that one needs it, then there may be as many as 2 billion people around the planet that lack access to that form of safely managed drinking water. So there's a lot of work to be done. And unfortunately, governments often lack the level of financial commitment and political will. Water is one of the best investments that we can make from a public health point of view, from a livelihood standards point of view, and there needs to be more emphasis. The other problem with the SDGs is that they don't take a rights-based approach. The emphasis is on the targets for water rather than the rights of people. Many of the barriers that people face relate not simply to scarcity and availability and the technology of delivering water, but also to rights of access, to land grabs, to the ability of communities to press legal claims when they're denied their access to water that they already have. And the battle to get the SDGs to take a rights-based approach was lost. Governments were not willing to go there. And unfortunately, that has denied local communities what sometimes can be a very powerful legal tool and moral tool to try to hold governments more accountable.
It'd be interesting to see that reconciled with the Secretary General's recent agenda, which includes democracy and human rights. Abule, let me come to you and ask Debora, I think just to carry on with this governance theme, have states come to grips with surface water, groundwater interactions in their water regimes and also their transboundary water management regimes?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer to that is no, they have not. There is a few exceptions to that, which we might, talk about later, but, neither domestic regimes nor transboundary regimes, they really don't take this interaction into account, which is critical because, there's one hydrological cycle, right? And recharge surface water to groundwater is just one example of how that cycle functions. But what has happened in North America and indeed across the globe is that, when states were trying to figure out how to manage shared water, of course, they focused on surface water that they could measure and they could analyze and study, and that they watched flow across territories. And so, the treaties and executive agreements that we have, they were really, in the 20th century put together to deal with surface water. Now, at the same time, groundwater was seen as this local thing, right, that we pull up out of the ground underneath our very feet. And so the groundwater regulatory regimes are very local, right? So you've got two regimes that grew up, alongside one another, are not linked. They're sort of layered but not nested as they should be, and they don't view sort of the water resource as one. So this is a huge problem because, again, to make the link back to what Abule was saying, what Ken was saying, if there's water scarcity and the surface waters dry up as they do for several months of the year in the American Southwest, the rivers run dry, right? The Rio Grande Bravo is an example of that. What does everybody do? They pump more groundwater. And they have rights too under local regulatory and rights regimes. So, what you're doing then is the unsustainable use of the underground water resource, right? So, and that's replicated across the world. And we have not figured out how to deal with this. And the regulatory regimes at the transboundary level and the international level have not yet caught up to that problem. I mean, I think people are working very hard on it, but we're still in a little bit of a management gap there.
Wow. So Abule, now let me come to you. Tell us your view on the heterogeneous effect of water scarcity by region.
Yeah, very interesting thoughts are coming up, and I'm really very happy. Yeah, when we talk about heterogeneous effects of water scarcity, I would love to talk about this concept called water security. We are mainly, we most of the time hear about food security, but yes, of course, water is part of food, but water security by itself, it gives us this heterogeneous effect of water scarcity all over the world. And because sometimes talking about access to quality of water that is important maybe for consumption or for production, availability of that water, affordability, and at the same time sustainability of water that is really helpful for human beings, or that is to the standard water quality that is available for humans, depends or is heterogeneous over time. For instance, for some countries, just access means even if they are drinking from a river or from a very dirty lake, they don't mind because that is access for some. But for some, there is still water, but it is not having the optimum level of calcium or potassium or some of these components that are really important for human health. Therefore, when you talk about water scarcity, we are differentiating regions or countries where what is scarce for one might not be scarce for the other, because we do have our own interests. Somebody who is very hungry can eat from the trash bin. That is what it means, right? So water scarcity by region, especially for Africans, the professor was talking about the same thing, because this developing world is suffering from this irregular precipitation in terms of intensity or timing at the same time. But why are this portion of the world suffering from this kind of water scarcity? Is it because of their own emission, or is it because what is happening in more industrialized countries, or because of the impact of those emissions from developed or industries that are not even control over the reason for climate change? So I think we have to relate this water scarcity with water security and think of those 4 pillars of water scarcity. Thank you.
Thanks so much for framing it so clearly. I want to extend on this concept of framing the issue of water scarcity. And Ken, can I turn to you? About a decade ago, the UN General Assembly declared water and sanitation to be a human right. So do those sorts of declarations make a difference in practice? How has recognition of a human right to water changed the landscape, if at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, and I find my students are often skeptical about the power of human rights. You know, they understand the power of making a strong moral claim. They understand the power of the ideal, but they have doubts about enforcement and compliance. And they're often right to be skeptical. But that said, I still think human rights are an essential tool, and a couple of reasons for that. One thing that human rights may make possible is the domestication of international standards. One of the things we see when we look at court systems around the world, particularly in newer legal systems, in newer constitutional orders, of which there are many, is that they will often use international standards, whether it's treaty law or whether it's UN declarations or whether it's, you know, the things that come out of global conferences. They'll often use those as part of the basis for a domestic ruling. There was a very important court case in Botswana not too long ago, just to take one example, around the water claims of indigenous peoples and indigenous communities. And the court did a very interesting thing in rendering its judgment, where it didn't have a strong body of precedent in Botswana law, relied in part on the UN General Assembly's declaration of a human right to water. Even though it doesn't have the force of treaty law, it's simply a normative declaration of the UN. And so that sort of domesticating influence can be important under the right circumstances. The other thing that human rights do is they shift the emphasis away from infrastructure and water quantities and onto people. Governments like to report statistics about people who are added to the water grid, you know, by laying pipe or by drilling boreholes. They pay much less attention to those who fall off the grid because they can't pay their water bill, because they've lost access, because of the informal standing of their housing settlement in a community. And I think the second critical thing that human rights allows us to do is keep the focus on keeping people connected to those systems.
Do you mind if I push on one button there that you—
Sure, please.
I think this domestication of international standards is so important beyond water scarcity issues. What are the tools that have proven useful at the domestic level? And of course, we've got variations across the world, right? Because of the varying natures of the ability to enforce. But,
sure.
And they could be enforcement tools. What has proven to be central to good domestication of international standards?
Sure. I think one of the big challenges is making sure that people have access to their legal systems. There was a very interesting study that was done by the World Health Organization, surveying governments and asking the question, do people in your country have a right to press a claim in the legal system around water and sanitation access? And second, has there ever been an actual court case? And what was fascinating was in some of the responses by governments were no, people don't have that legal right. And some of the responses were, yes, people have the legal right, and there have been court cases. But the single biggest category was, yes, people have the legal right, but that we haven't yet had a court case. Now, that might be because the right is very new and it's working its way through the system. So we need to look at this dynamically. But often the problem is activating that right in the legal system. And I think that the international standards of human rights and the way that activists and legal aid organizations and others can then empower people to start to use the court system for the rights that they may have on paper, sort of inflating the balloon of people's legal rights, if you will, is probably the key piece of that equation.
Thank you. Abule, what are your views on this link between water scarcity and human welfare?
Yeah, so this is simply a continuation of the discussion earlier, because when you talk about water scarcity by region, it is really heterogeneous, because one's problem might not be really a problem for the other. Yeah, so for instance, you can think about change in production and consumption pattern of individuals all over the world. Then that change in consumption and production pattern will lead us to, for instance, like migration. People will be, if they are not able to produce somewhere they are, because of there is no water for them to produce, and they have to migrate for somewhere. Then that is also a pressure for the other part of the world. So the welfare effect, it can be like, okay, if those who can migrate, but what about the local, the indigenous people who are living in water scarce areas because of this pressure and because of climate change? Then this welfare effect can be in terms of food and nutrition security of the society. Even then, people will be having conflict because of scarce water resources, and that will lead us to political instability. And then because of water scarcity, then there will be this health damage of the community. And all this will be a dead weight loss for the entire world, because we are in the same world, and something happening in one part of the world is also affecting the other part, which means, the problems are changing pockets. We are changing from our left pockets to the right pockets. So since we are living in the same world, so the welfare effect can be summed up in terms of both social, economical, and health issues. And it varies across the world, of course. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So Debora, just, what in your view is the single most important change in governance arrangements that needs to happen in order that increasingly scarce water resources are more sustainably managed, particularly in your region of research interest?
Well, again, I'm going to build on, where my colleagues were going with this and say public engagement, right? Mm. So you are not going to shake up water management systems if you don't bring in new and diverse actors and stakeholders that have different perspectives on how we manage water. And of course, you want to also make sure that there are folks that are interested in conservation and water sustainability included in there, right? But public engagement has to be, in addition to being broader, it has to be continuous and meaningful. So it's got to, take place from the very beginnings of what information do we need? Can we do that in a participatory modeling fashion, right? Which is, something that basins are starting to use. We need participation in deciding, how we use the information, how we make decisions, right? In how we implement things, and continuous, around the cycle again, right? So you're not going to change the system if you've got the same stakeholders and interests that are, still making the same decisions in the same way. So you want to crack open that system. Of course, this is hard, right? Because what I said about the rigidity of water management regimes in North America and elsewhere is that you've got these international treaties and agreements, and then you've got these water rights regimes, and then, you're trying to find a wedge in there to bring in more interest and try to shift the regime. It's very difficult, but there are good examples of where increased participation and participatory modeling has changed people's views and served in usually through process innovations, has served to shift regimes even a little bit. One, if I may, and just get a few seconds, we ran a survey on attitudes across all sectors around the Rio Grande Bravo and Great Lakes basins, asking folks for their perspectives on how does public engagement happen in your basin, and really what do you think about it? And it came up with some kind of interesting results. Of course, everybody across all sectors is really supportive of more engagement, but they have very low opinions of how engagement's actually happening at present. And relatedly, probably also low opinions of the ability of engagement to change sort of how we manage water outcomes, that we're ever going to get to a consensus on the way forward, things like that. So clearly, something has to be changed. And one last insight here that was quite surprising from the survey, everybody, including those who self-identified as government officials, said that government shouldn't be leading these things. So that there needs to be, the search for the third party that's seen as more neutral is key here as well. And then finally, those who identify as sort of the natural science community, so hydrologists, engineers, environmental scientists, all very negative about the regime and whether it actually listens to them. So anyway, some thoughts there, but I think public engagement and, cracking open systems and, really shining the harsh light of day on existing arrangements is one way to do that.
Sounds like we might need some water rights commissions. Let me come back to you on the issue of conflict, because one longstanding fear is that disputes between countries over water become flashpoints for violent conflict. And indeed, an August 2021 BBC investigation argued that impending water shortages are increasing the risk of interstate conflict over these resources. And scholars such as Aaron Wolf argue that there's little evidence to support the thesis that water wars are likely. This is sort of contrary to what Kamala Harris recently announced, and instead states seem able to manage water cooperatively almost all the time. According to your research, is there any evidence to show that conflict over water is likely?
Well, so the North American context, of course, is going to be different than other regions around the world, right? So from the perspective of the North American experience, conflict, there has been conflict, but it's managed through legal mechanisms and through procedures under treaties, and quite handily, I would say. So, there's conflict, and but the conflict, water users getting angry about what's happening with other water users works its way up to the regime, and then there's a resolution. And but things happen, like Mexican farmers, a group of Mexican farmers took control of a dam in Chihuahua, the state of Chihuahua, in 2020, and overwhelmed a group of soldiers that were in to sort of ensure that under the terms of a US-Mexico treaty, waters were delivered to American farmers. And so the Mexican farmers were there to make sure that didn't happen. So there was armed conflict. There were even politicians that were, for a short period of time were taken hostage, and cars were overturned. And, so things are heating up with scarcity, but even that was managed under the terms of the water treaty, right? So I would say that in North America, certainly we've been able to deal with that, but I think your real question is, could we get to conflict that kind of moves beyond that level? And I would say over the longer term, in the absence of broader comprehensive water planning, totally possible, because these are people's livelihoods, right? This is not, a hobby. This is not recreational. This is, can I survive this year, right? Will I have a crop this year? Anyway, so I would say that things may look different in the future.
So let's go to East Africa now, where Abule, I think I'm safe to say that geopolitics over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam are at a bit of a high at the moment. So do you think conflict over Nile water resources, for example, may be imminent?
Oh, yeah, because, the Security Council, the UN Security Council had a meeting now and then about the same issue, about the GERD of Ethiopia. But in this context, I feel like this water scarcity, or I mean, a conflict over water scarcity should be a pseudo conflict. For me, we are just attaching the conflict with the water or with GERD artificially, because in real terms, what it is, you know, the water is not the central point of conflict here, because it is the balance of power or the political and geographical interest of the nations in this area of, or in this region of Africa. Because we have seen where now, for instance, the GERD, the second filling is done last June, and then you can see, I mean, flood all over Sudan, and there is nothing happening in Egypt, and everybody was complaining now our water balance or our water shall be reduced because of the second filling of the GERD and something like that. But in reality, what is happening is we are, you know, attaching the regional power to the water scarcity issue. But in real terms, it is not. Of course, water can be a source of conflict because, as my colleague said, it is now the question of survival. If it is a question of survival, yes, because it is not only Nile, which is a transboundary river all over the world. There are so many rivers, even within East Africa. And there are rivers even from Ethiopia that are going, I mean, to different neighboring countries. And we can see there are countries like Zimbabwe and Malawi. We know that there is an issue in Senegal and even in Nigeria. So yes, water can be a source of conflict, but in East Africa now the central point is, I mean, the much weight is given to the political interest, not the water scarcity issue per se.
Yes, because at the end of the day, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is a national water infrastructure development project, correct? And Ken, I want to come to you and ask you about your views on links between violent conflict and water and climate change, but maybe because you've done so much work with the UN and on sustainable development goals, could you just start by expressing a view on whether or not you were surprised to see that issue being taken on recently that Abule mentioned by an organ, the highest organ in the United Nations, which is focused on peace and security and not so much national water development projects?
Yeah, it's an interesting case. I mean, I'm not sure the Security Council actually took it on. I mean, they heard about it, they had a hearing and they discussed it because Egypt wanted it to be discussed in the council. But they made it quite clear that they wanted the parties to resolve the dispute, that they were not going to invoke the powers of the Security Council to impose a solution on the basin. And this is one of the primary principles in international water law, including in the UN Water-Scarce Convention, which some countries have ratified and which has entered into force, which is basically, you know, there are certain principles that should be used to resolve disputes, and there's a global consensus around those. Equitable use of the water, avoiding significant harm to other states in the basin, sharing information, resolving disputes peacefully, but the actual details and parameters of that. So essentially what the Security Council has said is that it's not going to be in the future business of managing disputes in international river basins, because if it takes that one on, it's going to have a dozen on its doorstep very quickly. And so I think what that tells me is the need to strengthen the dispute resolution mechanisms that we have in existing basins. And this speaks directly to Debora's earlier point about the rigidity and the inflexibility. You know, we tend to think of treaty systems as sort of countries agree to put handcuffs on and live with certain fixed commitments. What we need is more flexible and dynamic management institutions in these treaties that, you know, that solve problems rather than simply work off of fixed rules and fixed allocations. The other thing I would say about climate change and the conflict risk is real, but I think it's more complicated than the media narrative of water wars allows for. Often the problem is not scarcity, it's rapid change that countries struggle to adjust to. If they've got time to adjust to change, if they've got a dialogue in place, if they've got institutional arrangements to manage change, then conflict risk goes way down. The basins that are at risk are the ones that do not have those arrangements in place. The other thing that's key to remember is that there's an enormous amount of violence going on around water already. This is not a future or theoretical problem for many people, but for most people, it's a sort of slow violence. It's a sort of structural violence. It's what comes from the displacement of communities, the violation of rights, the loss of access, the destruction of local ecosystems that people rely on for their livelihoods and to practice their cultures. And so we don't want to let a water wars narrative that I think can be managed with the right institutions in place distract us from that form of violence. We also don't want us to distract us from the fact that there's enormous cooperative potential around water. Water is simply not a problem that can be solved in isolation. It requires dialogue, it requires partnerships, it requires exchanges of the partial information that everyone has to create the more comprehensive information that no one has. And we can use that to bring people into dialogue, to try to generate cooperative knowledge about problems and solutions, to build trust over time, and to generate joint business benefits, to enhance the size of the water pie, if you will. So my concern about the water wars narrative is it distracts us from the really larger violence problem that's ongoing, and that it distracts us from the tremendous peace building potential that we should be exploiting.
Thank you. So, Deborah, agriculture and agricultural productivity key to peace and stability. And in water basins across the globe, agriculture is responsible for 70 to 80% of water use, and agricultural interests seem to occupy a sort of privileged political position in water management regimes, it could be argued. Are there any examples of where state actors have been able to make water use in the agricultural sector more sustainable?
Well, let me start by saying that it's very interesting that the position of agricultural stakeholders is literally entrenched in the water rights regimes in North America, right? And the water rights systems, they differ across U.S. states and Canadian provinces, and then they're sort of governed at the national level in Mexico. But the position of farmers is entrenched in all of these regimes. So that's the first problem, right? So how do you change a water rights system that has been in place for a very long time, and that provides security for agricultural interests? And politically, it's so difficult to change that. So even when there have been attempts, even around the Great Lakes, to try to address what farmers are doing around the lakes, at the state level, the agricultural lobby is unassailable, I would say. So what do you do? Because we're not going to get anywhere if we don't address agricultural water use. So, there's a few avenues for change. One, of course, is more efficiency in irrigation. You want farmers to use better technologies. This is very expensive. It requires government support. And in fact, if you look at what's happening in various parts of the US and Canada, farmers are actually switching, in the Rio Grande Bravo basin, they rely on flood irrigation in parts of California. So literally the most inefficient way to irrigate crops. And the kinds of crops we're seeing expanding are water thirsty crops like pecans, etc. So, we're not moving in the right direction at all. Again, if I can go back to my public engagement piece, there are some examples where if you bring agricultural water users into a dialogue with other water users, and you put all the best, as Ken said, whatever we know, whatever anybody knows, the science of, how a basin is doing, lay it all out, everybody chew on it. And, in places like the Colorado River Basin, they have drought contingency plans in place, and there are interim guidelines that the Department of Interior has put in place. And then there's, of course, a treaty process that also enters in. So there's layers of dialogue there that help to mitigate agricultural water use. And now in the Colorado, farmers will take a hit in the case of drought. But, this is a longer term process. Just a last thought on this. Farmers, and then there's agri-industry. And those occupy different positions in this struggle.
Thank you very much. Ken, over to you. What are the emerging problems around water and human security that no one is talking about?
I think this question around farmers, and I worry about the tension between farmers and cities. I mean, I think Debora is right that, when you look around the world, often you see the pattern she described in the United States and North America, where agriculture is kind of hunkered down and holding on to sort of an archaic regime of water rights. In the places where that is being broken up, and we see farmers increasingly forced to compete with other water users, the thing we've learned is that cities and industry are willing to pay a price that's an order of magnitude higher than farmers can afford to pay for water. A recent study, really sort of a chilling recent study that looked at almost 500 major cities around the world, concluded that given current water use trends and given current climate trends, fully 1 out of 5 was facing a high probability of conflict between agricultural water interests in the area around the city and water use inside the city itself. And our current institutions are not set up to facilitate a regional dialogue like that around water use for many of the reasons that Debora described. The other thing is equity. 40, 50 years from now, we'll be recycling more water. We will be storing more water. We'll be charging a higher price for water. And we'll be trying to design our landscapes to be more resilient in the face of flooding, in the face of droughts. Those are needed adaptations. They'll be forced upon us. The question is, are we going to do them in an equitable way? Recycling water denies it to someone else. Making room for the river means somebody has to move to make room for the river when it floods. And so navigating that in an equitable manner is something we need to really shine a spotlight on.
Very interesting. Abule, over to you. Does one size fit all to curb the effect of water scarcity?
Yeah, of course not. And, the conventional way of unilateral actions to curb the effect of what, especially water scarcity, will not work anymore for me, because any effect in one point of the globe will affect the other. Therefore, maybe for the United States to optimize its own water resources, or to have access to, or to curb any effect of water problems, they may need to invest in Mexico. The same thing works when you come to Africa. For Egyptians to have sustainable water flow and will not have that, welfare effect in them, they have to invest in Ethiopia. And the same thing, they have to invest in maybe in Sudan or Tanzania. So this kind of thinking, because to come up with an optimal solution of water usage so that we can have a win-win solution and avoid any effect or adverse effect of water scarcity problem, we need to come together and design a mechanism where we can have that win-win solution, because our comparative advantages are completely different. For instance, if Ethiopia is producing much of the water that is contributing to Nile is coming from Ethiopia, doesn't mean that Ethiopia should use all that water, but the more water we produce, the more the riparian countries will be benefiting. So for me, thinking of this unilateral action of curbing the water scarcity problems, we should come together and find an optimal solution to come up with a convergent solution for all of us.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to the questions that some members of the audience have posed. And I'd like to start with one which I think I'm going to direct to you, Debora. Is there an existing treaty, either global or non-water domains or regional water agreements, that might serve as a model for a multilateral arrangement of the sort that we're discussing here? And I think something that's most desperately needed at the moment.
Yeah, there's various models. The EU Water Framework Directive and how it mandates river basin management plans for shared rivers that of course are shared all across, both with EU member states, but also outside. They're really useful because that's where for an entire, first of all, the recognition is that, there's one water resource. It's surface water and groundwater. It's one of the few management regimes where those two are linked. They grab all the data. They bring everybody in, grab all the data. How much water is there? What's the quality of water, both surface, underground? What's the recharge rate? What's going on there? And then they, get a handle on what the problems are, and then look at everybody's regulations and say, so Germany on the Rhine, are your regulations strong enough to meet the EU directive regulations? France, what are you doing, right? Switzerland, that you've got a gap here, and they really kind of look at what is everybody doing, and where there are gaps, you got to fill it. But everybody works together, and it is it's a multi-stakeholder process. Now, of course, that's in an EU framework where you already have well-developed regulatory regimes, et cetera. So, I think the idea of river basin management plans is a really good one. The multi-stakeholder process is a really good one, just in terms of how we get to a plan that might work. At the international level, Ken's absolutely right? There's normative principles set out about how we should manage water, but it's regional arrangements that really give you the operationalization for how we share water and manage it together. So I would say look at regional arrangements, and certainly river basin management plans such as those in Europe, are a really interesting model to follow.
Thanks so much. And another question, I'm going to direct it to Ken. Part of the problem is dropping of water supply from climate change. How has water demand changed? Is this more a change in the population issue, but more intense and widespread economic activities that demand more water?
It's a great question. The state of California uses less water today than it did in the 1970s. Not less water per capita, not less water per dollar of output, less water in the absolute aggregate. And so if there's water scarcity, there's water scarcity. I mean, there are places in the world that suffer from absolute water scarcity. And I don't in any way mean to minimize that. Increasingly, what we're seeing is that industry is relocating to places where water is available. Farming is relocating to places where water is available. And while on the one hand, that can be part of an efficient adaptation, it has sort of enormous questions about reallocating the water supplies that exist. But more generally, if there's good news here, it's that there's an enormous amount of low-hanging fruit. I mean, for goodness sake, the toilet in my home uses, think about that water system. The city, I live in Baltimore, and the city uses more energy and water to purify the water, pump it to my home, recollect the sewage, treat the sewage, and then discharge it into a river than it does for the mass transit system in my city. I use 6 gallons of water to flush away a couple of ounces of urine. That water is treated to a world-class drinking standard. It's then put into my toilet. It's then sent back to the city of Baltimore, which uses a lot more water and energy to clean it. And then it's discharged into a river in a once-through flow. That's absurd. And before we start, concluding that we have bumped up against the absolute limits of water scarcity, we need to make the adaptations that are there calling out for us to make.
Thanks, Ken. We're quickly running short of time, but Abule, can you give us comments on the question of the impact of water scarcity on global migration movements?
Yeah, exactly. That is a very interesting question, because I even touched on that issue earlier on, because it starts from locally, and that is actually what we are experiencing practically. People start from their local migration, like from rural up to urban migration. As Professor Ken was talking about, then there is a pressure in the city where the living style is not really water saving and it is costly. So people opt for international migration, and people are dying in the rivers. People are dying crossing the ocean, right? We have experienced a lot of shocking incidents of migration. So all these are starting from the village where there is less production and productivity, food insecurity, and this damaging livelihood or significant damage in the livelihood of the population, especially in most developing countries. And people will try to migrate to look for a better life. Yeah, so we can really attach that one directly to climate change because, I mean, that is the resultant effect of water scarcity and that vicious circle. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Deborah, I'm going to start with you for our last round of top tips for policymakers. But I note that there's a question in the panel that asks about advice for young professionals, students wanting to get involved in this area. And I think it's an excellent question. So could you address those two things really quickly? And also that last fabulous question about 97% of the water in the world being salt water. Are there desalination options as 3% only as fresh water? So three things in 1 minute.
So really quick, desalination is hugely, hugely expensive. So again, will require, government subsidies, et cetera, And it's not only ocean water that's saline, increasingly groundwater sources are becoming more saline. So that's a salinity problem is emerging underneath us as well. I love the question about how to get involved if you're a student or a young professional. In your area, there will be a river basin or a lake or something. There will be an organization that is involved in managing that, a citizens group or what have you. There is always an organization that you can get involved with. But there are also lots of online forums to talk about water and to advocate for better water management. Finally, policy recommendations. I'm going to go back to my opening the process up, but I'm going to pair it with a recommendation. Information is so important, right? So again, shining that harsh light of day on what the situation is. You need the information, but you need to bring stakeholders in as you're getting that information so that they can see that information source as legitimate and then sit down together and talk about what you're going to do about the water resource.
Great, thank you. Abule, top tips for policymakers and for students and young professionals keen to get into this area.
Yeah, very interesting. So yeah, water scarcity is a real problem that we are facing currently, and it will be a serious problem in the future. So we need much more research, generating new knowledge, new information, and new technology to recycle water and make it like the way we are using water more efficiently, and more efficient recycling capacity of each country should be enhanced. And we need to also practice water harvesting. We have to invest in water harvesting mechanisms and technologies, but in most countries, it is not the water really scarce. It is actually seasonality of the water availability. So we need to work on water harvesting and make these technologies cheaper so that we can have enough water for all of us.
Thank you so much. Ken, finish us off. Top tips for both audiences.
I think it's the same for both. I think we need to recognize that in our water institutions, whether we're talking about a small irrigation scheme that decides which farmer gets water on Tuesday and which gets it on Wednesday, or whether we're talking about an international basin commission, the ability to facilitate dialogue, the ability to resolve disputes, the ability to generate the kinds of information that users need to adapt and to adjust. Those are capabilities just as much as the technical capabilities. And we have underinvested and underdeveloped those capabilities. And for students, we desperately need people with those skill sets. And so someone who knows something about water, something about the economics, something about the technology, but also about those social science oriented skill sets, perhaps acquired in an interdisciplinary sort of a setting, are going to be valued water activists and water professionals in the future. And so I would encourage them to consider investing in that form of training.
Thank you so much, all panelists, for what I'm sure the audience will agree was a great discussion. We hope you enjoyed it. You're all very, very smart people, and we wish you well with your work. Please join us again on October 21st for a special episode of Global Insights, where we will welcome students to give their perspectives on some of the world's most pressing challenges and how the international community can work together to address them. Until then, take care and stay safe. Thank you.